Somewhere off the coast of the Eastern Pacific, a low-profile vessel slipping quietly through open water just got obliterated by a lethal American strike. And at nearly the exact same moment, federal agents, thousands of miles away, closed in on one of the most wanted cartel leaders in the entire Western Hemisphere and took him into custody. Two separate operations, two very different outcomes, one man dead at sea and another now sitting in custody, facing the full weight of American and Mexican justice, but both telling the exact same story about just how relentless this administration's war against narco-terrorism has actually become across an entire hemisphere. So let's break down exactly what happened in these latest operations, how they fit into a much broader campaign that's already taken down some of the most notorious cartel figures on the planet, and why this specific combination of lethal force and high-profile captures represents a genuinely different approach to fighting organized crime than anything attempted in recent memory, spanning multiple countries and multiple criminal organizations simultaneously. If you want to keep following how this campaign keeps developing, go ahead and subscribe now, because between the strikes at sea and the arrests on land, there's a lot happening simultaneously right now, often moving faster than any single piece of coverage can fully keep pace with. And once you're through with this one, drop a comment telling me whether you think this two-pronged strategy, killing traffickers at sea while capturing leadership on land, is actually the right formula for finally breaking these organizations for good, or whether history suggests these networks will simply adapt and rebuild, regardless of how many individual leaders get removed from the picture. Let's start with the strike itself, because it's the freshest piece of this entire story. United States Southern Command announced that its forces had executed what officials described as a lethal kinetic strike against a low-profile vessel operating in the Eastern Pacific, a boat that intelligence had confirmed was actively involved in narcotics trafficking along established smuggling routes. The operation resulted in the deaths of two people that Southern Command specifically described as narco-terrorists, and it was carried out under the direction of General Francis Donovan, the commander overseeing this specific mission through what's known as Joint Task Force Western Hemisphere. Donovan didn't mince words in his statement following the strike, describing the operation as a clear and decisive reminder that Southern Command is taking the fight directly to the cartels, and adding that the United States would not permit narco-terrorists to operate with impunity anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, nor would it allow what he called their deadly poison to reach American communities. This specific strike matters partly because of the timing. It came just over 2 months after the last publicly announced operation of this kind, a strike back in June that killed 2 suspected traffickers while leaving 6 others wounded. That gap between operations had led some observers to wonder whether the pace of this specific campaign was slowing down after an intense stretch of activity throughout the earlier part of the year. This latest strike put that speculation to rest fairly definitively, confirming that Southern Command's mission, disrupting operations, dismantling leadership, and eliminating what Donovan described as cartel terror across the entire region, remains very much active and ongoing, even during stretches where the public announcements come less frequently than they did during the most intense early phases of this campaign. It's worth understanding exactly what a low-profile vessel actually is in this context, because these boats represent a genuinely specific and dangerous category of smuggling technology that traffickers have refined over years specifically to evade detection. These vessels, sometimes referred to as narco-submarines even though many don't fully submerge, are purpose-built to ride extremely low in the water, minimizing their radar signature and making them enormously difficult to spot from the air or by conventional patrol vessels. Traffickers have invested heavily in this kind of technology, precisely because it's proven so effective at slipping past standard maritime surveillance networks, capable of carrying enormous quantities of narcotics across open ocean, while presenting only a tiny, easily overlooked profile above the waterline for even the most vigilant patrol crews to spot. The fact that American forces were able to identify, track, and successfully strike a vessel specifically designed to avoid exactly this kind of detection tells you something important about how sophisticated the underlying intelligence and surveillance apparatus supporting these operations has actually become. Now, let's talk about the capture side of this story, because it represents a genuinely different tool in this same broader campaign. Just weeks before this latest strike, Mexican federal forces, led by the army, detained Alfonso Fernandez Magalon, known by the alias Poncho La Quiringua, in the municipality of Los Reyes in the western state of Michoacan. Mexico's Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch personally confirmed the operation, describing the suspect as a top figure within one of the region's most violent criminal cells, the Cartel de Los Reyes. The arrest was carried out under an existing warrant covering charges of unlawful deprivation of liberty and rioting, and authorities were clear that the capture followed sustained intelligence work coordinated between federal agencies and state security forces in Michoacan specifically. Los Reyes itself sits in a rugged, avocado-growing region of Michoacan, exactly the kind of agriculturally valuable territory that organized crime groups have fought over for years, competing for control of farmland, transportation routes, and the extortion networks that piggyback on legitimate agricultural business throughout that entire region. The capture matters for reasons that go well beyond just removing one specific leader from one specific criminal cell. It represents the kind of coordinated, intelligence-driven law enforcement operation that stands in genuine contrast to the more purely military approach represented by strikes like the one on that low-profile vessel in the Pacific. Capturing a leader alive means the possibility of interrogation, of gathering intelligence about broader organizational structures, financial networks, and criminal associates that a strike at sea simply can't provide. It also creates the kind of legal accountability, formal charges, a trial, a documented sentence, that sends a very different signal than a strike that ends in death without any of that judicial process attached to it. Both approaches clearly have their place in this broader campaign, but they represent genuinely different philosophies about how best to actually dismantle these organizations over the long run. Let's zoom out and think about how these two most recent operations fit into the much larger campaign this administration has been running against narco-terrorism essentially since the beginning of this year. This entire effort really accelerated back in early January, when American forces executed a mission to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro himself, an operation that resulted in Maduro and his wife Celia Flores being transported to the United States to face charges of narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and possession of illegal weapons and destructive devices. That operation represented an extraordinary escalation in how the United States approaches the intersection between foreign governments and drug-trafficking organizations, essentially treating a sitting head of state as a narco-terrorism defendant rather than simply as a diplomatic adversary to be managed through sanctions and negotiation. Maduro has pleaded not guilty to those charges, and his case continues working its way through the federal court system. But the mere fact that operation happened at all fundamentally changed the character of everything that's followed throughout the rest of this year. Just weeks after that operation, in February, Mexican security forces conducted what became known as the Jalisco operation, a mission specifically targeting Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, known throughout the criminal underworld as El Mencho. Oseguera had led that organization since 2010, and at the time of the operation targeting him, both the United States and Mexican governments had offered enormous rewards, up to $15 million from Washington and 300 million pesos from Mexico City, for information leading to his capture. Oseguera was seriously wounded during that specific military operation and died while being transported toward Mexico City, bringing an end to one of the most notorious criminal careers in the modern history of Mexican drug trafficking. That operation triggered a genuinely severe wave of retaliatory violence across multiple Mexican states, including highway blockades, arson attacks, and deadly clashes between cartel remnants and security forces that ultimately left dozens of people dead before the immediate unrest calmed down within about a day. The fight against Jalisco New Generation didn't end with Oseguera's death either. According to reporting tracking the aftermath of that operation, Mexico and the United States have maintained what's been described as an unprecedented ongoing offensive against that specific criminal organization in the months since, with 14 separate high-ranking figures within the cartel either killed or imprisoned, and a $25 million bounty still actively outstanding for information, leading to further arrests within that same organization. That sustained pressure campaign against a single cartel's leadership structure, continuing methodically for months after the initial high-profile strike against its founder, illustrates exactly the kind of patient, comprehensive approach that separates this current campaign from simply celebrating one dramatic headline and then moving on to the next target without following through on the broader organizational structure left behind. It's worth grounding all of this in exactly why the American government considers this level of sustained military and law enforcement pressure justified in the first place. Because the underlying human cost driving this entire campaign is genuinely staggering. Synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl trafficked through exactly these kinds of organizations, have been responsible for tens of thousands of American deaths annually in recent years, a public health crisis that's touched families across every state and every demographic group in the country. That death toll is really the moral and political engine driving this entire campaign, the argument that traditional law enforcement approaches, prosecuting individual traffickers, through the ordinary judicial process, one case at a time, simply hasn't moved fast enough or hit hard enough to meaningfully slow the flow of these deadly substances into American communities. Whether you agree with the specific methods being used, particularly the lethal strikes carried out without judicial process, understanding that underlying death toll helps explain why this administration has been willing to pursue such an aggressive, multi-front strategy simultaneously across so many different countries and organizations at once. Let's talk about what happened with Tren de Aragua too, because that organization's own leadership took a similarly devastating hit throughout this same period. Back in June, Trump announced that Hector Rustenford Guerrero Flores, known throughout the criminal world as Nino Guerrero, had been killed in what officials described as a swift and lethal kinetic strike carried out by United States Southern Command in coordination with Venezuelan authorities. Guerrero had transformed what began as a relatively contained Venezuelan prison gang into a genuinely transnational criminal operation, with tentacles stretching through large portions of Latin America into the United States itself, and even reaching across the Atlantic into Spain. He'd spent years incarcerated at Tacron prison in Venezuela's Aragua state, and remarkably, he used that imprisonment as a launching pad rather than an obstacle, expanding the gang's influence by extorting fellow inmates and bribing prison guards until the organization eventually assumed overall control of the prison itself, along with gold mining operations in Bolivar State and key drug trafficking corridors along the Caribbean coast. The State Department had offered a $5 million reward for information leading to his capture, and federal prosecutors in New York had separately charged him with directing acts of terrorism specifically targeting people inside the United States. There's an important diplomatic dimension to all of this worth understanding too, because none of these operations inside Mexico specifically could happen without genuine cooperation from Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum's own government, and that cooperation hasn't always been guaranteed or straightforward throughout this relationship. Earlier in this campaign, Trump had publicly floated the idea of tariffs and even unilateral American military action inside Mexican territory, frustrated that Mexico City had repeatedly rejected his offer to simply take out cartel targets directly using American forces without Mexican involvement. That tension eventually gave way to the kind of coordinated approach that produced the operation against El Mencho, with Mexican forces themselves carrying out the actual raid using intelligence developed jointly through the newly created Counter-Cartel Task Force. That evolution, from public friction over sovereignty and unilateral action toward genuine operational cooperation, represents its own significant diplomatic achievement sitting underneath the more dramatic headlines about specific strikes and captures, and it's arguably just as important to the long-term sustainability of this entire campaign as any single operation has been on its own. Let's talk about the Sinaloa Cartel dimension of this broader story worth understanding, because that organization has faced its own separate reckoning throughout the same general period. Ismael Zambada Garcia, known as El Mayo, one of the actual co-founders of the Sinaloa Cartel and long considered one of the most powerful drug trafficking figures in the entire world, was formally sentenced to life in prison back in July, along with an order to forfeit $15 billion in trafficking profits, for his role leading what prosecutors described as a continuing criminal enterprise, responsible for some of the most violent and far-reaching drug trafficking operations anywhere on the planet. That sentencing came after Zambada had pleaded guilty roughly a year earlier, closing out a legal saga against one of the actual founding figures of an organization that's operated at the absolute top of the global drug trade for decades. Separately, federal prosecutors in Florida announced charges just recently against Fidel Felix Ochoa, described as another alleged top Sinaloa cartel leader accused of leading a large-scale operation specifically responsible for moving fentanyl and other narcotics into the United States, a case built through what officials described as coordinated multi-agency law enforcement work, specifically designed to send the message that no cartel figure, regardless of rank or how well protected they believe themselves to be, sits beyond the reach of American justice. It's worth putting this entire strategy in some historical context too, because the basic approach of systematically targeting cartel leadership, one figure at a time, isn't actually new. It's been attempted repeatedly over the past 2 decades, with genuinely mixed results worth learning from. Back during the Calderon administration in Mexico, a similar kingpin-focused strategy saw dozens of the country's most wanted cartel leaders killed or captured in rapid succession, arrests and strikes that were celebrated at the time as major victories in the broader fight against organized crime. The problem that emerged from that earlier campaign, and one that critics of the current approach frequently point to, is that removing individual leaders without simultaneously addressing the underlying organizational structures often led to fragmentation rather than genuine collapse, with criminal organizations splintering into smaller, sometimes even more violently competitive factions, fighting each other for control of the territory and trafficking routes left behind. That historical pattern is exactly why the institutional infrastructure built around this current campaign, the dedicated intelligence task forces, The sustained multi-month pressure against specific organizations like Jalisco New Generation rather than a single isolated strike matters so much for determining whether this specific effort avoids repeating that same fragmentation problem or ends up producing a similarly mixed long-term outcome. Let's talk about the actual mechanism connecting all of these separate operations together, because there's a specific piece of institutional infrastructure that's made this level of coordinated pressure possible. Shortly after the operation that removed Maduro from power, Washington created an entirely new intelligence unit called the Joint Interagency Task Force Counter Cartels, operating under United States Northern Command, specifically to compile detailed intelligence on major trafficking figures and pass that intelligence directly to partner nations for coordinated action. The task force reportedly played a direct role in building the intelligence picture that ultimately led to the operation against El Mencho in Jalisco, according to officials cited in subsequent reporting. That kind of dedicated, purpose-built intelligence infrastructure represents exactly the sort of sustained institutional investment that separates a genuine long-term campaign from a series of disconnected, opportunistic strikes, and it helps explain why this entire effort has managed to sustain this level of intensity across multiple countries and multiple criminal organizations simultaneously throughout nearly this entire year. There's also a financial dimension to this entire campaign worth appreciating, because degrading these organizations isn't purely about removing individual leaders or intercepting individual shipments. It's increasingly about attacking the underlying financial infrastructure that makes large-scale trafficking profitable in the first place. El Mayo's $15 billion forfeiture order, attached to his life sentence, represents exactly this kind of financial dimension, an attempt to strip away the accumulated wealth that's historically allowed cartel leadership to live in genuine luxury, fund private armies, and bribe officials throughout multiple layers of government, even after individual operations get disrupted. Separate prosecutions targeting money laundering networks, including cases against individuals specifically charged with laundering drug trafficking proceeds through international financial channels, represent another piece of this same broader financial pressure campaign, recognizing that an organization stripped of its accumulated capital and its ability to move money internationally faces genuine operational constraints, regardless of how many replacement leaders step up to fill vacant leadership positions, after a strike or capture removes the previous figures at the top. Let's talk honestly about the controversy that's followed this entire campaign too, because it hasn't been universally praised, even among people who broadly support aggressive action against drug trafficking organizations. The strikes specifically targeting vessels at sea have drawn genuine scrutiny and criticism throughout this administration's second term, precisely because they represent lethal military action taken against individuals who, in many cases, are never formally charged, tried, or convicted of any specific crime before being killed. The White House and Pentagon have consistently justified many of these lethal strikes by pointing to the designation of organizations like Tren de Aragua as foreign terrorist organizations, arguing that this designation provides the legal framework necessary to treat vessel occupants as combatants rather than simply criminal suspects entitled to the full protections of the ordinary judicial process. Critics have pushed back hard on that framing, arguing that killing suspected traffickers at sea without any judicial process at all represents a genuinely troubling expansion of executive military power, regardless of how confident officials claim to be about the intelligence identifying any specific vessel or its occupants as legitimate narco-terrorist targets. That tension between the undeniable operational effectiveness of these strikes at actually disrupting trafficking routes and removing dangerous individuals from the battlefield, and the genuine legal and ethical questions surrounding lethal force used without any accompanying judicial process, is really the central controversy running underneath this entire campaign. It's worth sitting with both sides of that tension honestly, rather than simply celebrating the operational statistics, without acknowledging the legitimate concerns critics have consistently raised about exactly how this kind of authority gets defined, constrained, and held accountable going forward. A government that can order lethal strikes against anyone it designates a narco-terrorist, without requiring the kind of evidence and judicial review that would normally accompany a decision to take a human life, is wielding an extraordinarily powerful tool, one that demands careful, ongoing scrutiny, regardless of how effective it appears to be in the specific cases publicly disclosed so far. There's a useful way to think about the fundamental challenge facing this entire strategy if you consider the old mythological image of a hydra, a creature that grows 2 new heads for every single one that gets cut off. Critics of purely leadership-focused strategies against organized crime have invoked exactly this comparison for years, warning that removing individual kingpins without addressing the underlying economic and social conditions that make trafficking so lucrative simply creates opportunities for ambitious lieutenants to fight their way into newly vacant leadership positions, sometimes triggering exactly the kind of internal violence and instability that actually makes a region more dangerous in the immediate aftermath of a successful operation. even while representing a genuine long-term win in terms of removing specific, dangerous individuals from positions of power. The retaliatory violence that followed El Mencho's death, the highway blockades and arson attacks that left dozens dead in the immediate aftermath, illustrates exactly this dynamic in action. Whether the sustained, multi-front nature of this current campaign, hitting multiple organizations simultaneously with dedicated intelligence infrastructure behind it, manages to actually starve the Hydra rather than simply triggering another round of head regrowth, is really the central strategic question hanging over this entire year-long effort. Let's think through what this two-pronged strategy, lethal strikes at sea combined with high-profile captures on land, actually accomplishes strategically when you look at the full picture together. Strikes against low-profile vessels and drug trafficking routes disrupt the actual physical movement of narcotics, imposing what officials have repeatedly described as total systemic friction on these organizations' ability to move product from source countries into American communities. Captures like the one targeting the Cartel de Los Reyes leader in Michoacan, meanwhile, target the organizational and leadership structure that actually plans and coordinates those trafficking operations in the first place, removing the people who recruit new members, negotiate with rival organizations, and manage the sprawling logistics networks that make large-scale trafficking possible at all. Combining both approaches simultaneously, disrupting the physical supply chain while also decapitating leadership structures, represents a genuinely comprehensive strategy that attacks these organizations from multiple angles at once, rather than simply focusing on one specific vulnerability and allowing an organization to adapt and route around that single point of pressure. There's also a broader psychological and deterrent dimension to running these two types of operations simultaneously that's worth appreciating. Every successful strike and every high-profile capture sends a message to remaining cartel leadership and personnel that essentially nowhere is genuinely safe, whether you're running trafficking operations out on open water or hiding within what you believe is a secure, well-protected territory on land. That kind of comprehensive pressure, demonstrating capability and willingness to act across both maritime and land-based domains, arguably does more to actually deter future criminal activity than either approach could accomplish entirely on its own. Organizations that might have felt reasonably confident their leadership was insulated from direct American action, protected by distance, by local corruption, or simply by the sheer logistical difficulty of coordinating an operation against them, have had that assumption directly and repeatedly challenged throughout this entire year, across multiple countries and multiple criminal organizations. It's also worth examining how the bounty system underlying many of these operations actually functions as its own incentive structure. Because rewards ranging from $5 million for figures like Nino Guerrero all the way up to $25 million for remaining Jalisco New Generation leadership represent genuinely life-changing sums of money in the communities where these organizations typically operate. That kind of financial incentive creates real pressure from within these criminal networks themselves, encouraging lower-level associates, former partners, and even family members in some documented cases to provide the exact kind of specific or actionable intelligence that intelligence agencies need to actually locate and successfully target high-value individuals who would otherwise remain extremely difficult to find, given the resources these organizations typically invest in protecting their own leadership. The combination of that financial incentive with the dedicated intelligence infrastructure built specifically to process and act on tips generated by these bounties represents another layer of this broader strategy that rarely gets the same attention as the dramatic strikes and captures themselves, but likely plays just as significant a role in actually generating the intelligence that makes those operations possible in the first place. Here's the honesty check worth sitting with, though, because it would be easy to walk away from a story about dead traffickers and captured cartel leaders thinking this campaign has genuinely broken the back of organized narco-trafficking throughout the Western Hemisphere, and that's honestly not something the evidence fully supports yet. Drug trafficking organizations throughout Latin America have repeatedly demonstrated a genuine capacity to adapt and reconstitute themselves even after losing high-profile leadership figures, whether through death, capture, or extradition. The Sinaloa Cartel itself has survived and continued operating despite the arrest and conviction of numerous senior leaders over the years, including figures far more historically significant than many of those targeted throughout this specific campaign. Removing individual leaders, however dramatic and satisfying those specific operations might look in the moment, doesn't automatically eliminate the underlying economic incentives, the enormous American demand for illegal narcotics, and the deeply entrenched local networks of corruption and complicity that allow these organizations to keep functioning even after losing specific individuals at the very top of their leadership structure. What does seem genuinely different about this specific campaign, though, is the sheer breadth and sustained intensity of the pressure being applied simultaneously across so many different organizations and countries at once. Maduro's capture effectively decapitated an entire government's alleged relationship with narco-trafficking. El Mencho's death and the subsequent dismantling of 14 additional Jalisco New Generation leadership figures represents genuine, sustained follow-through against one specific organization over many months rather than a single isolated strike. Nino Guerrero's elimination struck directly at Tren de Aragua's founding leadership. El Mayo's life sentence closed out a legal case against one of Sinaloa's actual co-founders, and these most recent operations, the Cartel de Los Reyes leadership capture and this latest strike against a low-profile vessel in the Pacific, demonstrate that this pressure campaign hasn't slowed down or lost momentum, even as the initial, most dramatic headline-generating operations have faded somewhat from daily news coverage. So where does this actually leave things going forward? The institutional infrastructure built specifically to sustain this campaign, the Joint Interagency Task Force Counter Cartels, Joint Task Force Western Hemisphere, and the broader coordination between American and partner nation intelligence and security services, suggests this isn't simply a temporary surge of activity destined to fade once the initial dramatic headlines lose their news value. It represents a genuine, ongoing institutional commitment to sustained pressure against these organizations across multiple countries simultaneously, a commitment that's already produced results ranging from the capture of an entire sitting head of state to the elimination of some of the most notorious individual traffickers operating anywhere in the hemisphere. Whether that sustained pressure ultimately translates into a genuine, lasting reduction in the flow of narcotics into American communities, or whether these organizations simply adapt, reconstitute their leadership, and continue operating despite losing individual figures at the top, remains the central question this entire campaign still has to answer over the coming months and years. There's one final piece of the story worth sitting with, because it speaks to how these individual operations, however dramatic in isolation, ultimately connect to something much larger than any single strike or capture could ever represent on its own. Every cartel leader removed, whether through a lethal strike at sea or coordinated arrest on land, represents one fewer node in a sprawling international network responsible for genuine, measurable harm, reaching all the way into American communities thousands of miles from where these individual operations actually take place. That's ultimately the through line connecting Maduro's capture in January to El Mencho's death in February, to Nino Guerrero's elimination in June, to El Mayo's sentencing in July, all the way through to this latest vessel strike and cartel leadership capture happening right now. Whether history ultimately judges this campaign a genuine turning point in the broader fight against narco-trafficking, or simply another chapter in a decades-long cycle of leadership removal followed by organizational adaptation, likely won't become fully clear for years to come, long after the specific headlines generated by any single operation have faded from public memory. So here's the question I want to leave you with today. Do you think this combination of lethal strikes at sea and high-profile leadership captures on land genuinely represents the kind of sustained pressure capable of actually breaking these criminal organizations for good? Or do you think drug trafficking networks throughout Latin America have proven resilient enough, adaptable enough, and economically incentivized enough that removing individual leaders, however dramatic and satisfying each specific operation might look, simply isn't enough to change the underlying reality driving this entire trade? I'd genuinely like to hear where you land on that in the comments below, because there are real serious arguments on both sides of that question, and honestly, even people who study organized crime professionally for a living remain genuinely divided on which historical pattern this current campaign is more likely to follow. If this breakdown helped you understand how this latest strike and capture actually fit into a much broader campaign that's been running throughout this entire year, rather than just catching a single dramatic headline without the fuller context connecting it to everything else that's happened, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed coverage reach more people trying to actually understand the scope of what's happening across this entire region. And if you want to catch the next operation in this ongoing campaign, whether that's another strike at sea, another high-profile capture, or the next chapter in any of these individual cartel cases working through the federal court system, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Share this with anyone you know who's been hearing scattered headlines about individual cartel leaders being killed or captured without realizing just how coordinated and sustained this entire broader campaign against narco-terrorism has genuinely become throughout the course of this year, spanning multiple countries, multiple organizations, and a genuinely unprecedented level of institutional coordination between American and partner nation security services working together toward the same underlying goal. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.